Corporate Board Member presents an informational webcast. On this edition, What to Do When an Acquirer Knocks, with T.K. Kerstetter, President of Corporate Board Member, and Eliza Swann, Partner Global M&A Group, Shearman Sterling.
Welcome. I'm T.K. Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to an educational webcast that we're going to do on the topic of what to do when an acquirer knocks. And joining me for this educational webcast is Eliza Swann, who's a partner and with the global M&A group of Shearman Sterling. Welcome, Eliza.
Thank you, TK.
And I think a good place for us to start is what makes this a hot topic. So why don't you share that with the audience?
Sure, TK. Right now, corporations have more cash on their balance sheet than they've had at any time in the past 50 years. So that fact, combined with where some companies' share prices and PE multiples are right now, mean that companies are seeing a lot of buying opportunities out there. In addition, I think whenever you have a lot of volatility in the market, that in and of itself can be very, very tempting for some would-be buyers. If those buyers don't get the right response from a company, or if they cannot reach agreement with a company's board regarding valuation, then proceeding on a hostile basis is an option that some of those buyers take advantage of. Switching gears a little bit and looking at private equity, we've had some pretty shaky financing markets of late, but private equity sponsors are still finding ways to get deals done. They've been using more equity, they've been pursuing smaller deals just by way of example. So I think that given things that are going on in the markets right now, they are prompting some potential buyers to reach out to potential targets. So I think if you are a CEO or a director in this environment, I think this topic is as, or frankly, maybe even more relevant now than it's ever been.
So you're a CEO or a board member and that acquirer comes knocking. The logical question is, should you respond? And if the answer to that is yes, how would one respond?
Yeah, I think the situation, as you said, raises a lot of questions in a CEO's mind about how to react. And this proposal could come in from across the street or it could come in from across the globe. But no matter where the source, I think the questions are the same. And those are, what are my obligations? Do I need to tell my board? The proposal came to me in my capacity as a CEO. Are my fiduciary duties any different in that capacity than they are in my capacity as a director? And I think this last question is really key because it's not something that is discussed very much, but corporate officers have the same fiduciary duties to the company and to the shareholders as do directors. So what this means for officers is, among other things, is that candor and disclosure to directors are a must. So if you are a CEO and you receive a proposal, no matter where it comes from, you should circle back with other members of your executive team, with advisors, and definitely with your board members to coordinate a response and to determine what message should be relayed back to this potential acquirer.
Now, just to take that a step further, if you're the CEO and the person who's approaching you happens to be a private equity firm, is that a different answer than what you just reviewed? It
is a different answer, actually, and it's interesting because substituting in a private equity buyer to this scenario both raises and lowers the stakes at the same time. On the one hand, private equity sponsors don't typically go hostile, so not having the specter of a possible hostile deal hanging over your head will probably take a lot of pressure off of a CEO. On the other hand, private equity deals or acquisitions made by private equity sponsors tend to involve a rollover by management of their equity in the company. So this actually ratchets up a lot of pressure on a CEO from a fiduciary duty perspective. The bottom line here is that if you're a CEO and you are contacted by a private equity sponsor with an interest in possibly pursuing a transaction with the company, relaying that interest to your board as soon as possible is critical here. You and I have discussed in the past the fact that transactions in which management are participating, either through an equity rollover or otherwise, raise conflicts of interest in that they essentially put that management team on the other side of the table from the company and from shareholders. So that conflict of interest necessitates the formation of a special committee of independent directors to negotiate and to approve that transaction. That special committee, when it is put in place, needs to be active and engaged and in the driver's seat, so to speak, at a very early stage in the transaction in order to preserve the record and to preserve for the company as many options as possible. So what is true in the strategic buyer context in terms of candor and disclosure is even more true in the context of private equity.
Something that doesn't seem clear in all this is sort of disclosure.
Yes.
Of if you're the CEO, obviously you just talked about disclosure to the board, but what are the obligations of disclosure, and I assume particularly to the public, the investing public?
Sure, yeah. Well, in the absence of a leak, you don't need to disclose the fact that an approach has been made, that a meeting has taken place, or even that a preliminary proposal has been offered. At that stage, things are so preliminary and speculative that they're not likely to be material so as to require disclosure. On the other hand, if there is a leak and if there is speculation in the market, or maybe even there's been a press story released in a newspaper, and that has had an impact on the company's trading and trading volume, at that stage the company will need to say something. What that statement is and when that statement needs to be made are going to be dependent on the particular facts and circumstances, but not until that point would you need to make public disclosure.
So the lesson here is, I guess, sort of to be prepared. And so knowing that, what are the things that a company, or more specifically a board, should be doing to prepare for when somebody comes knocking?
Yeah, I think two things, TK. One, know who you're going to call, and secondly, know what you're going to say. I think in advance, ahead of time, it's important to identify your contact team, who you're going to call in case you get a proposal. So this could include other members of senior management, it could include advisors, both internal and external, and it should include board members. These are the people with whom you're going to coordinate in order to figure out whether and how you're going to respond. The second thing is that I would recommend would be, before you get that call and before you're faced with the pressure of a possible proposal, sit down with your board on a periodic basis and make a determination about whether the company would be receptive to an acquisition proposal if one were to come through. This will not only ensure that everybody's on the same page about where the company is and what it is or is not receptive to, but it also would give the CEO important guidance about how to handle him or herself in this situation, and maybe even provide the CEO with a specific message so that if an acquisition proposal comes in, the CEO could respond with that message, and then the communication back to the board is more along the lines of an FYI instead of a fire drill. So I think if you do those two things, no matter whether you are a CEO or a director, I think you're well on the way to being prepared for an acquisition proposal.
Well, this is a topic that we could probably spend hours on, but I will give you the chance on any final thoughts that you might have about this very timely topic.
I think at the end of the day, when all else fails, apply the golden rule. And in this context, that rule would mean treat your directors as you would like to be treated. So think about the fact that if an acquisition proposal comes in, and if that acquisition proposal leads to an actual transaction, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on who knew what and when they knew it. So think about your directors who don't necessarily have any involvement in the day-to-day management of the business. Put yourself in their shoes and ask yourself, what would I want to know and when would I want to know it, and proceed accordingly.
Well, it all sounds like great advice on a very important issue that all companies that are interested in growing and advancing will face. So, Eliza Swann from Shearman Sterling, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, TK.
And that will conclude our educational webcast, and we ask you to join Corporate Board Member for another one that we'll offer in the future that will make you a better director. Thanks for joining us.
Eliza Swann can be reached at eliza.swann@shearman.com. This has been a presentation of Corporate Board Member, an NYSE Euronext company.